Hello everyone, welcome to the Python developer course. This is for people who are getting started with Python, and today's going to be session 1. We're going to cover the basics of Python, go into a little bit of what is Python, what are variables, what are keywords, how do we write statements, and how do we use Python. So if you're new and if you're looking to learn more about Python and other things related to Python development, please subscribe to the channel. If you like this video, do hit the like button. Um, that will help other people uh, who are looking for Python related content discover this and get to this. Let's start with what is Python. You're here because you want to learn programming language, and you heard that Python is a great tool for you to get your job, do the project that you want to do, or um, do the work that you want to do with automating something in your life. So that's why I've come to Python. But what is Python? Um, how is it different from other programming languages? That's something you need to understand if you get into Python. Python is a high-level programming language, which is similar to like C++, Java. Most other of these languages are high-level programming languages. That is, it doesn't directly talk about the machine language or the assembly language. It is closer to English like uh, syntax and keywords, and it does not have specific instructions for different machines. So if you're writing a code for a Ubuntu Linux versus a Mac, um, or for a Windows, you don't write it differently. Um, you write it consistently for all of them, and then based on the machine, then uh, your language is either interpreted or compiled, and then your machine understands what you're writing, and then tells your um, actual operation in the machine to happen based on that. So high level program is where you write like don't write code that is specific to your machine. You rather write code that is common, and then the programming language is set up in such a way that it's either interpreted or compiled, so that it gets translated into machine related code that the machine has to understand, and then it runs it at that time. The second thing is it's interpreted. So I talked about two different types. Say while C++ or C is compiled. So when you write a code uh, that is uh, written in the C language, we compile the code and we produce a compiled file. That compiled file would be compiled based on what machine you're going to run it in. So if you compile it on a Ubuntu Linux versus a Red Hat Linux, you'll have different compiled files. Those compiled files are then run in those particular machines. Uh, that way, they have the instructions for those particular machines to run it in those different fashions. Those are options where uh, we actually compile and then run it. Uh, but Python is different. Python is an interpreted language. It does come with some problems. That is, the interpreted language is written in like Python is written the same for whether it's Mac or Android or um, Red Hat Linux uh, or Windows. Uh, but in the interpreted language, it doesn't get compiled as a pre-step before it gets executed. When the execution happens, at that time it interprets the code for that particular machine type, and then it runs it. So the disadvantage of being an interpreted language, for any interpreted language including Python, would be that it's going to be slower during the execution of the window. Next is, this is a scripting language. That is, you can write like a set of instructions and then ask it to execute it in the order of which you write your instructions. So that is typical to a lot of languages, and that's something that helps write long lines of code, huge logic, and then do it in a certain order, certain loops, um, condition based on stuff, and you can do functional programming. So all those things can be done because it's a scripting language. This Python is not a new language. So you've heard of Rust, you've heard of many other languages that have come in, like TypeScript. These are like much newer languages. Python is a language that was developed in late 1980s by Guido van Rossum, who's from Netherlands, and obviously very heavily computational mathematical minded person, and this person is still in charge of the Python Foundation and is helping out uh, with releases, with making sure the overall integrity of Python is still there. Um, but this was uh, Python was originally developed in 1980s. Somehow it has stood the 40 years of the test of time, and we still use Python today. Python was very different. Python version 1 was very different from what you see today in Python version 3. So most of you would have either have access to only Python 3, or you would have had some access to Python 2. But Python 1 is very different. The way the syntax is there would not even recognize how Python 2 or Python 3 is. In Python, in 2000, Python 2.0 was released, and then there were subsequent releases that came out since until 2008. After 2008, uh, there was a 3.0 release that came in, uh, but uh, uh, but since 2008 till 2020, they were maintaining both the 2.x version and the 3.x version. So there was a new version in 3, and sometimes there'll be a new version in 2 as well. So from 2.6 to 2.7, they did add new changes, added versions, but in 3 as well, they were maintaining that. But in 2020, I think they stopped. There's no more or any 2.x version being released. Um, it's not being maintained. There are no bug fixes going on. There are no new releases, no new features that are being added. So all that has been stopped. Going forward, it's just a version 3 that will maintain. The latest version of Python as of today is version 3.10.2. If you're a newcomer to Python, you've not used Python earlier, please stick to Python 3. Python 2 has slightly different syntactical changes, but most functionality that 3 has been either written into Python 2, or some of them have been like adapted into Python 2, where you can use the Python 3 syntax as well and do it in Python 2. But most of it is was maintained in both Python 2 and Python 3. So that was the case until earlier. But after 2020, only Python 3 is being maintained. I still have some clients who I work with who still use Python 2.7. They use it because it's much more stable, and they already have a huge library of code that is using Python version 2. Changing that to Python version 3 would be a huge Herculean task, so they're not migrating it as of now. Um, and for them, having stable code is a essential use case. So obviously they want to stick with it until they find a migration project from Python 2 to Python 3, and then move all the code over. Uh, but right now I know that not only this client, there are other companies who use Python 2.x, and they want to stick with it for the next year or two until they find their either the money to move it or a logical reason for them to stop and move it. But most of the companies I work with, they work with Python version 3.8, 3.7. Um, the newer companies do use Python 3.9 as well. So learning anything with Python version 3 would get you a good head start. Why do you choose to learn Python, or why do companies like Google, Facebook choose to use Python? Python is a popular language. If you go look at Stack Overflow, look at the popular tags, it's among the top 3 all the time. If you look at the job openings that are coming up, um, it's Java, C, plus plus, and C Sharp and Python. Those are the top 4, uh, like on most categories. If you're into a like specific domain such as front end development, Python may not be as competitive. If you're into full stack, Python may be not the top 3, but it'll probably be the top 5. But if you're looking into careers in data science, data engineering, you'll definitely find Python being either the top alternative or within the top 3. Um, if you're working towards API development, backend uh, web services, there as well, you'll find Python being the top 3, others being like Java or C Sharp. So it's very popular. It's one reason why you should uh, um, learn Python. A lot of companies use it. Python is interpreted. Um, so in a lot of cases where in real life business scenarios, speed is not the major concern unless you run heavy computational stuff where it's better to use C++ or C. Python is a very good alternative in most business scenarios where the advantage of using an easier language to use, such as Python, is 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 much heavier than the use of being really fast. So unless you're doing heavy computational stuff, interpreted language like Python is hugely preferred. Python is free, so Python.org maintains this library. There is these interpreters are available for all ecosystems, like including Android, Windows devices, like any um, firmware for your fridge that has any kind of uh, interpreter that you need for your TV. Um, Obviously, for any Windows system, Linux system, all interpreters are being maintained. So Python.org takes care of all those things. There are also libraries that are being added to PyPI, so that is a huge library of content, and that's being maintained as well. Python is portable, so you can write your code for Linux. Like you could say, for example, we had a code that was written on a Linux box uh, using Red Hat, and then like the client did not want to use RHEL anymore, Red Hat Linux. Um, the enterprise Linux was much more uh, expensive, so they wanted to move on to a like free version of Linux, and they were able to port the code without any changes to the code. So that is why Python is portable. You can use it in different machines, and it will just work as expected in the other machine. Obviously, when we moved the code over, we had to test it and make sure we had the it was uh, a batch flow where we had a lot of data transmission and writes to database. So we had to make sure the code is portable. So we had to test it. So you do have to test it, but it's typically portable. Python is very very interesting uh, as a huge career prospect because it's easy to learn and easy to use. So a lot of companies use this because it's easy to learn. a lot of people who want to get into companies, they um, they use Python because it's very much easy to learn and use. It has an extensive library, so you have so many APIs that we need to call. Typically, if you want to call a social media API like a Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, there are libraries that have been written just to call the APIs. You don't have to write your own functions. You don't have to like set up different uh, uh, API calls and then set up the credentials for them and then do the calls and then pass the results. You don't have to do all that. There are extensive libraries written for those things, especially when you're data science, things like pandas, NumPy, um, scikit-learn. So those things are pretty extensively written, and those can be used, um, and that helps you choose Python. Let's talk about the next topic, which is now that you want to know you want to go get into Python. So you would probably want to install Python on your system. So I assume you have a Mac or a Windows or a Linux laptop, and you want to install it on your system. Or say you have a phone, you don't have a laptop, you want to install it on your Android device or a iOS device. So you can go to python.org/downloads. You'll find the latest version. Today, when I looked at it, it was 3.10.2. Um, for my computer, I could just go to this link and download it, or I could go to the Microsoft Store. Given mine is a Windows computer, I could go there and search for Python and then download that, and that would be a very simple way to download. And sometimes if you have an office laptop and you don't have administrator rights, you can go to the Microsoft Store, and typically your administrator would have allowed you to download stuff from Microsoft Store, so you would probably be able to install it. If you are into like Linux, you can use the command line and install it. Mac OS, Linux typically come with Python. Um, I'm sorry, Mac probably does not come with Python, but Linux typically comes with Python. So you can check the version of Python. If you want to upgrade it, then you can upgrade it. Otherwise, you already should have Python in your system. Um, Other than having Python installation installed, it's typically easier for you to use IDE. IDE is a developer environment which is integrated with the type of programming language you're using. So if you want to use that, that would be used in you can download it one of the IDEs. Um, like some of the examples of IDEs are Visual Studio Code, Thorny, Pycharm, Spider, and if you're using for data science, you can use Anaconda, and it comes with like Spider and Jupyter notebooks, so you can use those. Uh, and Thorny is a very light IDE which you can use for compiling your Python code and running your Python code. It's very lightweight, and it is it has it colors the keywords based on the names of Python, but it is just a few more kilobytes more than your Notepad application. Um, the one I use is Visual Studio Code. Um, PyCharm is used by a lot of data engineers. Spider is used by a lot of data scientists and data engineers. So you could choose one of those. Say you are not able to install any of these IDEs and you still want to use Python, you can go and use these online Python interpreters. And these are some options: python.org, Replit, Python Fiddle, Trinket, or Python Anywhere. And like I'm gonna quickly show you the Python Anywhere, or the python.org uh, online if you see that, you can see that if you go to python.org.shell, you should be able to get to this, and then you'll be able to type in your keywords. You could type in your commands, so you can go ahead and print. Typically, the first thing that every programmer does is print hello world to make sure everything works. Do that here. If you want to write a few more command lines, like you can do something like this: I is I is 10, j is 20. If you want to print I plus j, that should so these two get stored in the memory, and then this returns out the variable that comes out from there. So all this can be done using the online interpreter. Let's get back